Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's Anthony Carpen here. I'm on Norwich Street, just around the corner from Hills Road, which is there. So that gives you an idea of where I am geographically. Now, just behind me is an unimaginatively named building called Charterhouse. And before it was built, it used to be a Methodist chapel. And it was, in the grand scheme of things, quite a lovely building, but it was built very much to a similar pattern to not just the Methodist chapel on Castle Street, a long way up the road that way even, but also to other Methodist chapels built around the mid-1800s. The reason why the building got knocked down was because post the Second World War, congregations across the city and across the country at churches were declining, and the Methodists couldn't afford to not just renew the lease but just pay for the basic repair bills that were needed for actually quite a splendid chapel. So unfortunately, when the lease expired, they handed it back to, I think it was Norwich Union, who were the freeholders, who knocked down the building and replaced it with really quite a bland, nondescript office blocks, similar to the ones that you see just over here, which is currently occupied by Cambridge Assessment. Now, the buildings all the way along this part of Hills Road, which is the main road into town heading northwards, there used to be a number of, if I can call them, Georgian stroke Victorian townhouses, and throughout the 20th century at various stages they got knocked down to make way for office blocks, in particular in that post-war period. The reason why I'm looking particularly at this part, this is kind of the Newtown part of Cambridge. New because when it was originally built in the 1800s, it was very much outside the historical core of the city. So I'm kind of jumping from the Anglo-Saxon Norman period, kind of like through the part where the university got founded, to where the borough really started expanding. The other reason why I'm here is because of this book, Cambridge at War, The Diary of Jack Overhill. It's one of the best books I've read describing Cambridge's experience during the Second World War, and it very much mixes up the unique insights of someone who was really in a minority, a conscientious objector during the Second World War, someone who managed to stay out of military service throughout the conflict, and who was very, very left-wing generally in terms of his views, with a hint of, dare I say it, a strain of anti-Semitism that reflected the time. Not that it justifies it. It certainly doesn't. But it's just a fascinating read of both what was going on in Cambridge at the time, but also in terms of the wider war context, but also in terms of just the day-to-day life and how people coped with the air raids. Because not a lot of people know, and I went through the county archives to check this out. Over 30 people died in Cambridge due to the air raids, and over 70 people were injured. There used to be an air raid shelter near here, and it's very well described in Jack Overhill's diaries, brilliantly edited by Peter Searby. If you want to get hold of a copy, do go to the third floor of the Cambridge Central Library into the Cambridgeshire collection, because they're on sale there. I think it was about £18, which seems quite expensive, but the book itself, basically, if you're a local resident and really interested in the history of our great city, and I call it our great city because from my point of view it's my home, so I would say that. Not saying it can't be better, it can. But it really gives you some sort of a historical grounding of what life was like for the ordinary citizen. And in the case of Jack, he, like I said, this was his neighborhood, and you really get a sense of just how different the living conditions were for people living in this part of town compared to today. So I'm going to wander down Norwich Street, and I'm going to have a look and see if I can find some of the things, some of the places that are featured in Jack's diary. But before I do that, I want to come back to Peter Bryan's book, which is obviously Cambridge, the Shaping of the City, and is very much, as I mentioned, the structure of this this series of short videos I'm making about the history of Cambridge, the borough. And he says in chapter 12, the expansion of Cambridge in the 19th century, there were about 6 or 7 factors that drove the physical expansion of Cambridge beyond its historical core. And he attributes those to the following. The first was obviously the increase in population during the 1800s. Anyone who's done a geography GCSE will be able to tell you all about the decline in infant mortality combined with initially the maintenance of family sizes. So a lot more children and young people were surviving into adulthood to have children of their own. This was brought about by changes in, for example, increased provision in public health. One of the things I've noticed in the archives, again, in particular the newspaper archives, are contracts all around sewage systems, street lighting, medical improvements and things like that. Industrialisation, bringing people in from the countryside. Better transport systems were around the corner from the railway station, and one of the other books, The Cambridge That Never Was, which I've got in my bag, has some very interesting diagrams of where some of the railways were planned for, but how the university basically said, no, we don't want the railways going anywhere near here. We also have the marked expansion in public education. So it wasn't just the buildings themselves, but the numbers of people coming into Cambridge as the university expanded, because you had colleges such as Selwyn, for example, being built around that time. I think Newnham and Girton were a couple of others. A strong desire of many of the wealthy middle classes in town to live outside of the historical core, which was seen to be unhealthy. They wanted more space. And then in 1882, the freeing of university teachers from the demand that they should renounce their college fellowships if they got married. What was also happening at the same time was more of the land was being effectively drained around this area. So whereas in previous centuries you couldn't build on it, in the 1800s you could. And so what we will see as we take a wander through this neighbourhood is some of those buildings that were built. But actually, I think instead of going down Norwich Street down this way, I'm going to go down a road that was mentioned very much in Jack Overhill's diaries, which is called Russell Street. Now, today it's a nondescript cul-de-sac, but in Jack's diaries, if I look at the map that that actually Peter Searby's produced, we very much see that Russell Street went all the way through to Panton Street, the road kind of at the end of this one here. And it also had a school down it, and we're going to go and have a look at that school now. So I'll see you soon.